Join us this new year for new conversations at the Commonwealth Club.
Welcome to the Commonwealth Club. I'm George Hammond, Chair of the Humanities Forum, which organized tonight's event. I'd like to welcome you if you're watching this a live stream or if you're watching it later on YouTube. This is one of over 700 programs that we've done at the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco since the pandemic began a little over 2 years ago now. And we are enjoying the process. We wish that we had people in our audience. We're enjoying the process of bringing to you what we usually brought to you to our live audiences, to bring it to you online so that people can see what people are thinking about all across the world. We've brought in authors from everywhere. Now, today we have Sarah Mednick. She's from San Diego, and she has a great new book called The Power of the Downstate. She's a psychology professor at the University of California, Irvine, and she's also in charge of their sleep lab. So she does research in this area, and she's written a book. First, we're going to talk about that research, because there's a lot of recent research on the brain that those of you that read about about brain research even 20 or 30, 40 years ago, it's not quite, the thinking is not quite the same as it used to be. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. But first, I'd like to ask you, how did you get to UC Irvine, and doing this kind of research, and how did you end up in charge of the sleep research lab? And just a little bit of background on that.
Great. Well, thank you. First of all, just thanks for having me. It's a thrill to be here. Let's see. I was getting my graduate degree in psychology in the Harvard psychology department, and I was in a vision lab studying perception, and I walked in on a lecture that Bob Stickgold was giving, and this is when he first started doing his research. He was the first person to really develop a method to study the effect of sleep on memory. There had been a lot of kind of ways of looking at sleep that were sort of more, like, does your daily content of your life influence your dreams? And, some animal studies but nobody had really figured out how to do it with humans and memory. And so it's so simple when you say it, but really he had developed this paradigm of test people on a memory test, let them go to sleep, and then test them again when they wake up, compare that group to a group that didn't sleep, right? And then just look at the differences in performance, and then look at what's happening in the brain while the person's sleeping, using the EEG that you were recording during the sleep, which is recording the electrical activity in the neurons in the brain. And this was such interesting. This is such an interesting approach, and also so novel that he could show that you needed 6 to 8 hours of nighttime sleep, and you needed this amount of slow wave sleep, and you needed this amount of REM sleep, and then you would show these improvements in memory. That was so interesting, and he was such a wacky, interesting character that I thought I could work with this guy. And so I approached him, and he agreed, and my advisor in the vision lab at Harvard, Ken Nakayama, also agreed, and they let me build a little sleep lab in the vision lab in the printer room, and I got a little bed, and I got a little portable EEG system, and I kind of learned how to use that. And then I started looking at naps, because nobody could figure out why naps would work. Why would a nap of, say, 20 minutes to an hour make you feel amazing, but if you took that kind of sleep in the middle of the night, it would feel like crap, right? Like that wouldn't be enough sleep. So we started doing these studies on naps, and then that took off and became my first book, Take a Nap, Change Your Life, because it just showed, wow, the nap is a very special sleep opportunity. There's something interesting happening during the day, that you're getting this enough slow wave sleep and enough REM sleep within one period that you could show the same magnitude of memory improvement as people did after a full night of sleep. So was one
of your first students there Bill Clinton, because he was known for doing this?
I have a great quote of Bill Clinton, who said that he thinks that sleep deprivation is the main cause of all of the strife and difficulty in Washington today. And I always thought that that was right on, right? Because people used to, you know, they had their home in Oklahoma, but they would spend long periods of time in DC and just stay there and do Washington business and then go home for vacations. But now they're constantly going back and forth to their constituents and having to be constantly on, and that people are exhausted. And so it's making people less thoughtful, less compassionate, and making poorer choices.
Yes. Well, one of the other things you mentioned in your book, which I think people don't focus on, is that Article 24 of the UN Declaration is,
the right to rest and leisure.
Yeah,
exactly.
People don't talk about
yes.
that one a lot, as you said, yeah.
No, it's the one of all of these, you know, these were supposed to all be human rights articles that are our basic human rights as human beings, that you know, we are born into the world with these, and, you know, inalienable rights. I can never say that word. And this idea that, you know, Eleanor Roosevelt was one of the main supporters of this idea, is that not only do we need to have, you know, the right to not be slaves and the right to speech and, you know, represent ourselves, but also we need to be able to take a break. That actually, you know, our rest time is a human right, and it's something that we need, and it's part of living. You know, that the rest should be part of living. But that is the one article that throughout the history of that Declaration of Human Rights, people have said that they should take out because that's not important.
Yeah,
it's not as important as all the others.
We want the people to work for all the time. Not
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's go to the science about this. Now, there's two systems in the body, in the nervous system, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. And you equate that with this, the downstate, the upstate, as you call them. And when you put out the statistics, like the average amount of sleep is 68 hours, and then you have the weekends, and then a couple of other things, and it's almost exactly, we spend about half the time in one state and half the time in the other of our time. So about, you know, our life is split between two different things. So tell us a little bit about how those two systems operate, and maybe a little bit of the history. When did people figure that out? Because they didn't have that idea.
Right. Well, you know, there's so many things that you just brought up. So first we have, right, so we have the central nervous system, which is basically, you know, the brain and the spinal cord. And then we have, and that's taking care of sort of, you know, all the neurons and making sure all the motor neurons in the body, and, you know, are all functioning well. And then we actually have a system, as you mentioned, the autonomic nervous system, which is kind of taking care of what used to be thought of just taking care of like the guts and the water power functions and the temperature, right? Just keeping us at the, you know, the right plumbing systems, but nothing really cognitive and nothing emotional and nothing about the intellectual things that we always thought was going, that the brain was taken care of. And more, and so the autonomic nervous system, as you said, has two branches. One is the sympathetic, which is the fight or flight system. It's the stress response. In the book, I call it REV, because it's the one that revs you up. And then there's the parasympathetic, which is the rest and digest. And this is sort of a sister system to the REV system because it's the restorative, right? The second that you're revving yourself up, you have to restore and calm down. This is incredibly important for homeostasis and balance. And the more you have a good ratio between the sympathetic or sympathetic and parasympathetic, the more healthy you are, because you're able to calm down your stress response, calm down that arousal system, and go into a state of deep relaxation to restore after this very stressful, energy depleting exertion, which happens, you know, all day long basically, but also when we're stressed out. And so you need to go into this restorative mode to replenish whatever energy you used up and to calm the system down and get it ready for the next rev response, right? And so the idea is that we're actually these things don't just happen randomly, but that things happen in rhythms, and that we are, as animals, living beings on the earth, we are based in rhythms. And we have rhythms where the rhythms, why they're good, is that they provide us periods of upstates and downstates. And during the upstates, we're optimized for this exertion and this kind of, arousal response, because we're provided with all of the energy that we need, all the nutrients. Our brains function at their best during that time. Our bodies functioning at their best, at its best at that time. And after this upstate, you go into a downstate in order to repair the tissues and rebuild the systems that were used up in the upstate, and get it ready for the next upstate, right? So it's just a rhythm of upstates and downstates. And you see this across many different systems in the body and the brain. In deep sleep, you can see that we have these slow waves, and the slow waves have an upstate and a downstate, where the upstate is where all of the neurons are speaking at once, and you have massive neural communication, and then suddenly the brain goes silent, and all the neurons go silent and they stop firing. And this happens many hundreds of times across a night as you're going into deep sleep. And so the idea for the book was really coming out of this idea of saying that we've kind of forgotten this framework of rhythms, and how important it is that we have upstates and downstates, and that the more we can abide by these, particularly, paying attention to the downstates, the stronger we'll be, and the better we'll be, and the more supported we'll be in our upstate.
When people talk about, restoring the body by sleep and stuff, it's often like an abstract idea. But it's not abstract. The body is flushing chemicals out. And I mean, the way you distribute energy, as you say, in the book, even our senses, we think of them as we see things, we hear things. But whatever waves we take in through our different senses is translated into electrical impulses that are passed along our nerves. So those nerves use chemicals to do that, and they have to restore themselves, just like a battery has to restore itself. I think you used that analogy. And so that chemical process requires that firing doesn't take place, but instead the chemicals all get washed out again. I think it's important, for people to understand how physically oriented that restoration process is, because they say, oh, I'd like to get 5 minutes of sleep, and then I'll be fine. It doesn't, the chemicals all don't change in that amount of time.
Yeah, it's astonishing how much we put on sleep to take care of ourselves when we're awake. In that period of time, we sort of, the things that we can get done are all of our daytime experiences, all those memories that we want to hold on to, information that we want to learn and hold on to, that all gets strengthened and consolidated into long-term memory, and then associated with all the things that we know from our past and kind of integrated into our semantic knowledge networks. We have a whole flushing system, as you said, where we have waves of cerebral spinal fluid that wash the proteins that are used up while we're thinking and doing and being, that get left over in the brain. And you need to wash those away on a nightly basis, because if you don't, they can grow into these tangles that go along with symptoms of dementia and Alzheimer's later in life, right? And so that you need this as a daily practice of washing those chemicals, those proteins away, or you actually have this buildup across time, right? So and then you also have protein synthesis that occurs during sleep. You have the repairing of muscle tissue, the decrease of the sympathetic arousal system, and the increase of, say, growth hormone. And a lot of different antioxidant properties take off during sleep as well. So, yeah, it's doing a lot of heavy lifting for our day-to-day activities. Yeah.
Where is the science now on the connection between the lack of sleep and Alzheimer's? You just mentioned that. I mean, we know that there's a connection, at least a correlation between these, development of protein entanglements and everything in your brain. And so it looks like that's the cause, or at least one of the causes. But how much research is there that like not getting enough sleep is one of the reasons for that?
It's a really great question, and it's a very exciting new area of sleep. There's really just the beginning of understanding how these things are related, but I'll talk about a couple different studies that kind of will elucidate where we're at. One study, there's a really great guy at UC Irvine, Bryce Mander, and he's done a series of studies looking at, in older adults, how, the frontal lobe is really the functioning center for executive function and inhibition and focus, selective attention, working memory, all of these things that taking all the information from the brain and kind of sorting it out and deciding what you should be doing and what you should be paying attention to. And this is also the area of the brain where you have these slow waves that I was talking about during sleep that are so important for all of these benefits of sleep. What Bryce and others have done is shown that the relationship between the memory decreases that we see across aging and the decrease in slow waves that we see across aging, and the shutdown of this frontal lobe area that we see across aging are all related to each other. What is happening first? Is it that sleep starts to decrease, that we maybe spend less time focusing on what I call downstate activities that really enhance sleep and focus? And is it really like the slow waves that start to decrease? Is it that we stop learning new things as we get older? So it's kind of like a use it or lose it mechanism, where if you don't really use that brain area, it starts to decay. And so that's why we stop having this good functioning in that system. But there's many, we have no idea the causality, but we do know that that there is this very strong relationship between decreased functioning at the behavioral level, decreased activity at the frontal lobe, and decreased slow waves during sleep that are all related. We also know from other studies that washing away, that is called the glymphatic system, right? Because there are glia in the brain, and people didn't really know what the glia were for. And there's a lymphatic system in the body that cleans out the body. And what a woman in Denmark, I can see her face. Anyway, I'll think of her name a second later. What she discovered is that actually these glia are taking care of that washing away of the toxins. And what we now understand, that goes on during deep sleep. And what we now understand is that even small amounts of sleep deprivation, like one night of sleep deprivation, can leave those proteins in your brain, and they don't get washed out with subsequent nights. So, and this is at in midlife, you can see the effects of how well people are sleeping, and then longitudinally, what is their risk of developing dementia and Alzheimer's later on in their 60s and 70s, so 70s and 80s. So we don't know, we don't have it all written down, and we have all figured it out, but these are the pieces. And the pieces really are pointing to what we're doing in, our 30s and 40s, when we stop focusing on these downstate opportunities that create more relaxation, higher parasympathetic activity during the day, but also better sleep at night, that this has an effect later on.
Let's go to a big piece about brain research that has shifted over time. If you go back to the early 70s, there was like a right brain, left brain, and one does one thing and the other does the other thing. And now there's a lot more information about the plasticity of the brain, that if you lose part of the brain, that it can be rewired. So even though a lot of research shows that activity goes on in different areas of the brain for different purposes, if you lose part of the brain, sometimes that can be rewired. Is that correct? I mean, that's basically
Yeah, the younger you are, the better off you are at the rewiring process. But for sure, it's never too late. It's never too late to start exercising. It's never too late to start eating better. It's never too late to start doing brain games and, to start doing HRV or, deep breathing exercises that increase parasympathetic activity during the day. Whenever you start to see benefits. So I think that's something that, sometimes the things I'm saying sound like, oh, it's all screwed, like whatever. It's too late. But it actually, all these research studies show that this, the moment that you start taking care of yourself, you start to see benefits and you see long-term benefits. So for sure, there's a lot more plasticity than we give the brain credit. There's a lot of ability for it to bounce back and rebound.
Excellent. That's good news for everybody.
Yeah.
So, because everyone thought, once I've ruined it, forget it. And,
I'm just going to eat Cheetos for the rest of my life.
Yeah. So you mentioned something very briefly, HRV, and I really wanted to talk about this for a while because that's something I've done a lot of reading in this area, but that's not anything people have focused on. So it's heart rate variability, and it's the amount of time between your heart rates. And as you quoted someone say, the heart is not a metronome. It doesn't go boom, boom, boom. That there's variation. Now the variations are in hundreds of milliseconds, you said, so it's not like a big variation. So who figured out that this was important, and how strong is the correlation between having larger differences, more variability being kind of good that's correlated with having a happier life, and the other one? And where is the state of this research too? Because you mentioned it a lot, and I thought it was fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, there's I think at this point, we're just beginning to appreciate the role of, HRV is a reflection of the autonomic nervous system, and I'll explain what that is. But I'll just say right now, we are just beginning to appreciate the role of the autonomic nervous system in every aspect of our life. In terms of science, in the brain, in our emotions, in our well-being, in our physical health as well. So I think that it's a really exciting time to be in this field. So let me just explain a little bit about what the HRV signal is. I just realized that I have to turn my phone. Oh my God, thank God. My phone wasn't off. So the HRV signal, heart rate variability, exactly as you say. I love that line. Who is it by? Fred Stone or something? Something like that. And where the heart is not a metronome, that we have different times between our heartbeats. And why is that important? Well, if you think about your ability to immediately react to what's going on in the world around you, be it something positive, be it something negative, is it to run away? Is it to go hug somebody? And then is it to get excited? But then also you want to be able to calm down if there is nothing wrong, right? And you want to not be at this, it's very, it takes a lot of energy and it's very corrosive to constantly be at a high stress. So the second you don't want stress, you want to be able to calm down. Well, a good metric for your ability to, roll with the punches of life and then recover really quickly is your heart rate, because the heart is pumping blood through the body and the brain to where you need, is it muscles? Is it the brain? Is it your stomach? Whatever it is. So you want to have a system that can quickly ramp up and let you run away from the tiger. And then if it's not a tiger, to quickly calm down and realize like everything's cool. Let's just go back to status quo. And that means that a heart rate should be able to quickly change. And so the more variability you have in your heart rate variability, the more your system is able to adapt very quickly, flexibly to the environment and to changes in the environment. And that heart rate variability is really under the control of the restore system of the parasympathetic system. It's the sympathetic system that revs you up, and then it's the parasympathetic restore system that comes in and calms you down. So we measure this heart rate variability as basically reflecting how how well your brain is able to control your body and create either the response to the environment that's running around, or the response to the environment that's calming down. Hold on for 1 second. Go out. Thank you. My kids just walked in.
Yeah.
So
I could tell by the smile on your face.
I know. I was like, oh my God, I know that. I know those people. I know those little feet. When we talk about heart rate variability, what we're really looking at is your ability to have a good rev restore ratio, a good sympathetic parasympathetic ratio. And how that's related to your brain is that this is actually the system that's in control of this restore rev ratio is the frontal lobe. That area I was talking about earlier. The stronger your ability to sort of use your top-down mechanisms of saying, okay, everything's cool, calm down, we're all safe, we're good, there is no tiger, that really is reflecting how strongly your frontal lobe is in charge of your heart. And is in charge of your guts, and is in charge of all of those physiological systems below the neck. So when we see high heart rate variability, what we're saying is that person has a strong frontal lobe and is able to really flexibly control the physiology to respond to the world.
There's also learning how to make that happen through biofeedback, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So why don't you say just a little bit about that?
Yeah. So
I mean, does it make you to be more strong-willed and stuff like that, or is it just
Yes.
a biofeedback thing? Yeah. Okay.
No, for sure. Because think about the fact that the root of this calming down system, of this kind of restoring, replenishing system, is your breath. So when you are in a stressed response, your heart rate increases and your breathing gets more rapid, right? You suddenly want to, right, start to have sort of panting breath. And so the first thing, it's very hard to just immediately calm your heart rate down. But what you can do is calm your breathing. And so when we engage in slow, deep breathing, what we're doing is we're shifting our breathing into a controlled, steady state that basically is telling the rest of the body that everything's cool, there's no reason to panic, we're all good here, right? And I can have this very strong, controlled breathing where my breathing, my respiration actually is in sync with my heart rate. And I can talk a little bit more about that if you want, which is that the heart rate has a specific frequency of speeding up and slowing down and speeding up and slowing down. And the respiration is much faster. And so we have this kind of non-efficient system where when you're inhaling very quickly and exhaling very quickly, that speeding up of the heart rate that's trying to gobble up all that oxygen isn't really gobbling up that much oxygen because you're already exhaling by the time it starts to speed up, by the time the heart rate. So when you slow the breathing down to basically 6 breaths per minute, you're creating a synchrony between your breath and your heart rate such that the slow inhale is coupled with the speeding up of the heart rate. It's gobbling up all the oxygen. And by the time the exhale is happening, the heart starts to slow down because it's inefficient to continue to be super fast at beating. So it slows down because there's no more oxygen. So then you see, when you do this slow, deep breathing, you amplify your restore system and you get this really strong increase in your HRV signal. So that's just with, engaging slow, deep breathing. And that's one of the items that I really recommend that people do in the book, which is, 10 minutes of just slow, deep breathing, or just slow, deep breathing all the time, whenever you possibly can. But as you said, you can also get a device that's a HRV biofeedback system where you can get a visual signal that can tell you whether you're really syncing up the heart and the respiration. And that is a much kind of, it's just a much more direct signal to let you know how well you're doing in terms of slowing down your breath to match your heart rate. And then when you do that biofeedback, you usually see these really big increases in HRV. And then there's a woman at USC, Mara Mather, who shows that about 6 weeks of this HRV training actually really shows changes in the brain associated with a stronger frontal lobe, larger white matter volume. So some pretty, amazing restorative, strengthening experiences that can happen with just slowing down in the middle of the day. Doesn't just all have to happen at sleep.
Well, you mentioned a few things in your book, so I can go here, but I'm sure you must hear from some yogis about all this, because it sounds a lot like pranayama and other breathing exercises they've been talking about. But the one question I wanted to ask you was, the Indians in their medicine, they have something called pulse diagnosis. Doctors who diagnose the pulse, all they do is put their fingers on your pulse, and then they tell you what's wrong with you. I don't know whether any of that is accurate or not. But if they can tell the difference in the heart rate variability, they might be able to pick up something that way. But you haven't read anything about that kind of research, I assume.
No, but I think that you're right. I think that that's probably, there's something in there. I don't know how long they'd have to listen to it
Yeah, exactly.
to get a good signal, right? Like, I mean, I doubt it could just be a couple heartbeats. But, you could probably tell a lot by just saying that's a high heart rate. And we're just sitting here. Why, what's going on over there, right? So there's probably but how, I don't know.
The rest of it's telepathy and not scientific, so we won't go there.
Who knows?
But you did mention, you mentioned, we'll get some more of the practical advice a little later on, but you did mention a story which I thought was funny, and I had come across it before, about these Buddhist monks in the Himalayas that have a contest as to who can dry the towel. Why don't you, they do sort of training, and they can change the heat of their body by 14 degrees, you said. So is there any?
I actually really, I read about that in James Nestor's book, Breath.
Right.
And I thought, what? And so I actually went back to the Science article that was published, in the 50s, I think. And there are these guys who are basically in the monk triathlon monks, like they are, and they live in these like tin huts in mountainous snowy regions, and they have breath work that allows them to create so much heat in their bodies that they can literally change their temperature by large amounts, such that they can go from having freezing cold wet towels on their backs to however many minutes later, these are dry towels on their backs, and they just steam that just comes off of them. And the competition is how many wet to dry towels can you get, and that's the winner of this competition. And so I'm sure a lot of garbage gets published in Science magazine, but it was in Science, and I think, wow, that's that's a pretty astonishing feature of the autonomic nervous system, that if that's actually possible. And we've for the most part, Western medicine does not engage with that kind of information, or with that kind of self-regulation. And power, right? It's a powerful tool. So,
well, I think it's maybe they don't engage because you don't encourage people to spend their lives learning how to dry towels, through yogic abilities. Because
why not?
You must not have anything to do in the Himalayas if you spend your time trying to dry towels that way, or there's no electricity to do it with a dryer. It's a very fascinating ability to be able to do. But I think when you read some of these other stories that are similar, you think, it's got to be a better way to use your time than to try to develop this talent.
Yes, and it points to a self-regulation ability that I think, as modern industrialized cultures, we have lost.
Yeah.
So there is something in there that's self-healing, and is a level of interoception, like a self-knowledge of bodily self that is also lost. And I think that we expect a lot of we have a high expectation for medicine and pills,
Right.
and not a lot on our own ability to, detect disease and to self-regulate. So I think there's something there that I think probably we would do good to also recognize.
Yeah. I agree with that 100%. I just make a joke about it because it's just like, there are other ways to use
Who's
that
got the
but
time?
it is
Yeah,
just like
who's got
showing
the
up. It's like
time?
showing up. Look what I can do, and there are other elements to it. Absolutely. But it's
Yeah.
interesting because, as you said, we approach a lot of modern medicine from pills, but I think you're in one area of the science of the brain and everything like that, and we're amazed, and we should be amazed at how much we've learned in the last couple hundred years about our bodies. But we also have to admit we probably still only know 2 or 3 or 5% of what's going on at the very most. And so we should be open to be surprised. I mean, that's the scientific way of doing things. And
Absolutely.
yeah. So let's go back to the changes in sleep theory, because as I recall, when I was younger, it was like there was 2 parts to sleep. There was deep sleep and there was REM sleep. And REM sleep was when you dreamt, and deep sleep was when you didn't dream. But that seems to have changed quite a bit. Dreams show up in other places besides REM sleep, etc. So why don't you lay out in your book the 4 different stages. The 1 stage is just the getting started one, but the 3 stages, and you showed the map of how it happens. Why don't you tell everybody what they're doing when they're not paying any attention while they're sleeping?
Right, when they're checking out. So we go into different stages of sleep, and they're categorized based on their brain activity. That each stage has a specific features of sort of electrophysiological features. Which I mean by that is that the brain is emitting a little blip of electrical energy that is a way of communicating between neurons, and those little signatures of sleep seem to be grouped into different sleep stages. So we go into, as you said, we have stage 1, which is just that kind of falling asleep stage, but it's also pretty critical, right? That's really when you have a really big change in your heart rate. Everything slows down at that point, and you get heart rate slowing down, temperature decreasing, blood flow slowing down as well. And your brain activity also starts to slow down. So instead of being in a state of multitasking, where a lot of the different areas of your brain are doing different things, right? Seeing different things, listening, thinking, tasting, remembering, right? All those different aspects, that all means that those different brain areas are asynchronously firing, right? They're kind of communicating in different ways. But when you fall asleep, your neurons start to synchronize, and the whole busyness of waking starts to decrease, and you see these much more slower rhythms. And actually, rhythms of the sleeping brain are between 0 and say, I would say maybe 20 hertz, or maybe a little bit faster than that. But whereas thinking is up in the hundreds, right? So when you go into stage 2 sleep, what you find is something called a sleep spindle. And that's a really interesting, it's a little spindle-shaped electrical signature of stage 2 sleep. And that seems to be a sleep event that is reflecting neural communication between your memory brain areas. So that the more you see sleep spindles during sleep, the more people wake up and remember what they were learning before they went to sleep. You also see that there's correlations between the amount of sleep spindles people have during stage 2 sleep and their IQ scores, so intelligence scores. So there seems to be something very cognitive in the amount of sleep spindles. And then when you're going into deeper and deeper sleep, you start to see these slow waves, and they start in stage 2, and then they kind of get deeper and stronger in slow wave sleep. And that's the other part of the brain that we usually call deep sleep. And you're right that sometimes you can have these kind of mentation type of dreams. They're not the kind of wacky dreams that you get in REM sleep, but you definitely have some sort of dream-like behavior that's sort of less crazy. And you stay in that. So when we're going into our sleep, we basically go into a sleep cycle, and each cycle basically means that you're going to go through all the different sleep stages: stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, and then back from deep stage 3, you'll go into stage 2, and then up to REM sleep. And I say REM sleep is up here, and it's at the end of a sleep cycle, because REM is very different than slow wave sleep. Slow wave sleep is a period where your brain, all the neurons in your brain are synchronizing to this slow wave. And it's literally a 1 second electrical experience in the brain where the whole brain goes into a state of up state where the neurons all start firing, and then a down state where the whole brain is quiet. And it happens like a wave. It starts in the front of your head, and it just goes all the way back. So it's this really interesting like waves of electrical activity that probably match the waves of that lymphatic clearance, that plumbing system we were talking about. And so neurons is a very different brain state than waking, because there isn't all that random firing. Everything is firing very synchronously. Once you get to enough of that slow wave sleep, then you pass through stage 2 again and over to REM. And REM sleep then is a period of really wild, random firing that looks just like waking. In fact, it used to be called paradoxical sleep because it looked so much like waking that the only way that people could identify that the subject was sleeping in REM sleep was that they had atonia, because, when you're in REM sleep, you have full muscle paralysis, as which functions to help people not live out their dreams and go running through their house and then barge through a glass window or whatever it is. You're fully paralyzed while you're having these kind of crazy dreams. And so then you spend a little bit of time in REM sleep. And then once you have satisfied this sleep cycle, then the whole thing starts over again. But the way that our sleep is organized across the night is actually that because slow wave sleep is the most restorative, right? This is really where you get to decrease all the stress hormone cortisol, and you have really big increases in growth hormone, and you see all sorts of immunological benefits. You see memory benefits, clearance benefits, all this kind of restorative stuff that's really, really critical. Most of your slow wave sleep happens the first hours of your nighttime. And then once you've satisfied your need for slow wave sleep, it becomes less and less and less and less. And then REM starts to take over, which is why we have a lot of REM sleep in the morning. And when you wake up, you sort of feel like, I've been dreaming all night. But it was really just that morning period where you had your REM sleep.
Well, we have a lot of questions coming in, which is great.
Okay.
And we'll get to them in just a second. But first, there's two things I'd like to do. One, the questions, and then we'll talk about the practical advice you have in your book. And if we won't have time for all the good practical advice, but the book is there.
People can always get a hold of it.
To get all those details. We'll talk about the
And
big
people
issues.
can, and people can go to my website, sarahmednick.com, and I'm on Twitter, Sarah_Mednick, and I can always answer questions through if we don't get to enough today.
Great. But before we go on to the questions, I want to ask you about the other Dr. Mednick who did research in this area. And are you related?
Yeah, Sarnath Mednick, he was my dad. There's so many things that I feel like I was just following in his footsteps in terms of science. So when he's one of the first people who suggested that the brain and the hippocampus in particular really matters. The hippocampus is the memory area, and he had a whole idea of the importance of the hippocampus for schizophrenia before anybody was talking about the brain. He also did a whole bunch of research on the developing brain in the pregnant mother, developing brain of the fetus, and how different traumas to the mother during the pregnancy period could have an effect on the developing brain, which could then have a later effect on the adult human child. So that's, one background. But before all that, it's not before all that. It was actually during that time, he was very interested in how development in early childhood, not just in the pregnant, in the fetal stage, but also in early childhood, how did nutrition, how did any kind of trauma, any kind of stress on this child affect his or her development into an adult. And so he created this project called the Mauritius Project, and quite amazingly, he started these preschools in Mauritius before this time, and the control was just the typical care for children at that time was just kind of, to be cared for by the small schools that were there or by grandparents. And so he developed a system where the children would come, and not only would they be put into a preschool where they would, have academic learning, but they would have nutrition. Mm-hmm. And this was the most important probably program that he started, was showing that nutrition in early preschool time had actual effects on the intelligence, but also on the behavioral outcomes of people in their teens and their 20s and their 30s. Mm-hmm. So he would watch these kids develop, and he would show that when these kids were given really good meals every day in preschool compared to whatever the normal food was, and whatever normal treatment was given during, in the experimental preschool group, they showed that the levels of malnutrition, levels of any kind of trauma actually had effects on the growing adult, where there was more behavioral problems, there was more criminal behavior, there was decrease in the academic scores. He also was one of the first people to introduce the idea of omega-3s in the early diet, mm-hmm. to help with brain development, and showed that actually omega-3s could have impacts on developing adult as well. So, and this was in the 60s.
Right. That research was an inspiration for Head Start, the Head Start program.
Yes, right? Exactly. So people have, there's nothing new under the sun, right? But I feel like our modern culture tries to make us forget the importance of these basic qualities of life. And I think, part of my book is really just saying, let's bring it back to the basics, because these basics are what we need as animals. They're what we need as living things to actually be healthy.
Yeah, I mean, you even show that in some research that rats, if they take a nap, can learn their mazes faster. So they must, and you think that there's evidence that they're dreaming, that they dream their way, because the nerves in their brain fire, or the neurons fire the same way that they do when they're trying to learn it. That's research. So.
And that's that spindle I was talking about. Yeah. That is related to that spindle. The more spindles they have, the more of that replay that they're showing during sleep, and the better they are when they wake up. And that's true for humans as well.
So you're not in favor of our society that makes people proud of being stressed out, or more stressed out than other people?
No, or I remember Qualcomm, they had this, is a big company here, and it's a great family. They give a lot to the community, but they also, one of their mottos is a highly caffeinated company. Like, not a big sell for me, no.
Maybe they just have an investment in Folgers.
Right.
All right. Well, we have a lot of questions from the audience, and so let's go to those. And thanks for sending them in. So here's one from Bhavani Chandraksar. What is the difference? Oh, wow. What is the difference between brain and mind?
Well, that's really good. I guess the way I think about it is the brain, when you're a neuroscientist, you're studying the brain. Mm-hmm. When I'm thinking of the mind, I'm actually thinking of studying the brain, studying the neurons, studying brain activity, studying blood flow, studying, sort of plastic changes that occur with performance. That kind of stuff is what I think of the brain. But the mind is sort of the whole nut, right? It's the whole, it's how we use our conscious behavior and conscious thinking to interact with the world. So I think that there's a level of consciousness that kind of gets put into the definition of mind that I think it maybe the brain is the hardware and the mind is the whole system.
That's one of the best answers I've heard of that question.
Is that a regular question you get here?
I thought it was going to be, oh my goodness. Okay, so Arun Verma asks, the best way per your research to fall asleep, any suggestions? Yes, she has lots of suggestions.
Tons. First, read my book.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Why don't you do a couple of the basic ones?
Yeah. Well, I think that one of the things that I think that we forget a lot about when we're just thinking about sleep is, well, what did I do all day long leading up to sleep? And a lot of the time we're just thinking about, sleep hygiene, create a dark space, cool space, quiet, wear earplugs, all that stuff, and write down all the thoughts and try to get to bed early. And all of that stuff is covered in the book for sure. But I think that the thing that I like about, I think what I'm adding that's new is that people are not focusing on the entire day and what they did the entire day. And we expect that we can just be in a super stressed out state that just ramps up our, revs up our system all day long. And it gets to this point, and then suddenly we're at the end of the day and sleep is supposed to just take care of all of it, right? But we're overstressed. And we are, exposing ourselves to all sorts of light that and emotional experiences that are not necessarily conducive to sleep. And we haven't done enough during the day to really decrease those stress responses. So I would say, think about what you're doing all day long. What time are you exercising? What type of exercise are you doing? What time are you eating? And when are you stopping eating? And what did you eat? How much of this deep breathing have you been doing? Have you done anything like, spend 10 minutes with your legs up the wall to give your heart a rest in the middle of the day, so that it actually, you have a decrease in your heart rate. So I guess that's where my book is coming from, is trying to see yourself as a whole system, and that there isn't necessarily like a silver bullet that's going to give you the deep sleep, because it's really about what you're doing all the time that affects everything else.
Well, you had one practical piece of advice for older people, which is don't drink anything for the last 3 hours before you go to sleep. So, and your explanation of it was slightly different than it didn't have to do with sphincter muscles or anything. It had to do with something else as to why that decreases. So why don't you explain that idea?
Yeah. So our circadian rhythm, right, which is, we have every cell in the body has a little clock inside it, and we have this part of the brain that is the conductor, and it tells you when to be aroused during the day and when to be going into your down state during the night. And it's controlling a lot of our bodily functions. And one of those functions is your bladder. And when you're young, you have this very strong circadian rhythm that tells you, okay, you can pee all day and then stop peeing at night. But as we get older, our circadian rhythms become weaker for many reasons. A lot of them have to do with the fact that we're just not getting outside in the day and getting enough bright light. We're not jump-starting our circadian rhythm with exercise in the morning. And so we get these weaker circadian rhythms. And what that means is that we also have weaker bladder control at night. And that inhibition of the bladder starts to get a little weaker. And so one of the main issues for people as they get older is that their sleep gets fragmented because they need to wake up to pee. So if your bladder is empty at night, that is a much harder thing for you to, it's an easier way for you to get past that problem. So I recommend, at least 2, but probably 3 hours before bedtime to stop any kind of liquids, because then you get your bladder empty, and then you don't have so many middle of the night wakenings, and that allows you to get into that deeper sleep.
Nice, kind of common sense, practical advice, but could save quite a few hours of unsleep, because a lot of people wake up in the middle of the night and then don't fall asleep very easily because the other things are in their mind. So before we go to the next question, you talked about the Middle Ages a little bit, and that people would get up in the middle of the night for a little while and then do something. But we don't want to go back to that, I hope. But why don't you explain what the people used to do, because I think not everybody knows about that.
Yeah, there's a historian who wrote a book, um, Roger Eckrich. I know the last name is Eckrich, and I know the first name starts with an R. And the book is called Night, and it talks about, he did a historical analysis of diaries and what people were writing about their experiences. And what he found is that people would sleep in two sections. They would have first sleep and second sleep, and then in the middle of the night they would get up and do things. And this, it matches on perfectly with today's adults who in their late 30s, early 40s, they start to have these middle of the night awakenings. And this idea is that this may actually be part of your natural circadian rhythm to become more fragmented. It may be something that isn't as, pathological as people often want to sort of create these pathologies. Of course, you want to have 8 hours of consolidated sleep, but if you don't, there's a historical precedent for the idea that maybe we've been kind of, spending some time awake in the night for eons.
So instead of thinking of themselves as pathological, they can at least think of themselves as medieval.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. That's better.
Yeah, right. Or just, and is there something that you can do to deal with, first, the second you wake up, don't necessarily think it's a bad thing.
Right.
And so you don't start the train whistles like, right? And then also make sure that you don't expose yourself to any kind of blue light, because that really will tell your brain that it's morning. So, you could wear the blue light blockers. You can have circadian light bulbs that will only be in deep yellows during the night. And also we have a recent paper, first author Simon, is progressive muscle relaxation. And we've shown that even in a short nap, you could get 10 minutes more of deep sleep, slow wave sleep, if you do progressive muscle relaxation. And actually, I have a audio version of that progressive muscle relaxation that we used in the experiment. In my first book, Take a Nap, Change Your Life, if you go to the Audible version of it, there's a whole section that you could just download, which is just me telling you how to do this. And so you could listen to that as a hypnotic trick in the middle of the night.
Great. So now we have another question. This one's from Karen Kilman. I participated in Professor Matt Walker's sleep lab. Have you found out anything that's new that was discovered after his book, Why We Sleep? Are you familiar with that book?
Sure. Matt and I were in, Matt was the postdoc in the lab of Bob Stickgold when I was the graduate student. I was his first graduate student and Matt was his first postdoc. So Matt and I have been in parallel the whole way through, and we do basically the same kind of research. So whatever I'm saying is kind of, Bryce Mander, the person I just talked to, that was Bryce Mander, was his graduate student, or his postdoc. So we're all kind of creeping around the same stories.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
From Diane B. How does mindfulness meditation play out? Upstate, downstate, or something else?
No, it's all downstate. It's, the root of all of our restorative practices, mindfulness, meditation, of many ranges of meditation, yoga, Tai Chi, they all start with breath, right? Getting in contact with breath, and then mindfulness, the addition of that is becoming an observer of your thoughts and not attachment, right? Non-attachment is definitely a system of being able to watch the arousal state happen, watch the thoughts happen, and also be able to calm it down through non-attachment. So definitely mindfulness is right there as a core practice of the downstate.
From Peter O. What is the impact on brain chemistry or physiology of sleep disorders which prevent deep sleep, such as RLS or sleep apnea?
There's so many that we could point to. That's kind of a big question. And, you could point to some that are neurochemistry, maybe there's some genetic issues, there's anatomical issues. There's so many potential things. And then, you can also get issues from medication that you're taking for another disorder that may be affecting your sleep. So that's a whole big nugget that I think people who are using different types of medication I think it's important to think about how active, when is the best time to be taking medication? Is there a sort of a chrono pharmacological approach that you could bring that would mean that the medication that you're taking is doing the least harm to your downstate? I think that's something that you could talk about with your doctor. But yeah, that's a whole world that's complicated and needs a lot of more research.
Well, here's a nice simple question, but it's from Tom Magny. Are there deleterious effects from too much sleep?
Yeah, in some cases. So it's funny. It's like you hear a question, and then you think of all the different ways you can answer that question. So there's some really interesting. Yeah, right. That's kind of why I wrote this book. Really, is because it's like you have so much that you develop in your head, and you just want to put it out on paper. Yeah. So I will say. Definitely there is from you can be somebody with something called hypersomnia where you sleep a lot, but you wake up tired, right? Your sleep is inefficient. There's something potentially constructive is potentially a way of using this word about your sleep. And even though you stay asleep for long periods of time, whatever is restorative, that's supposed to wake you up and make you feel like I'm ready for the day, isn't happening in your sleep. So that's there's also that you can sometimes have too much of one type of sleep. So for people with depression, there's a hypothesis that people with depression have too much and too intense of a REM period, and that may lead to some of the sort of the mood-related issues that you see with depression, and potentially why some of the medication that people take for antidepressant medication, why those may be successful in part, maybe because they reduce your time in REM sleep. So definitely not all sleep is good sleep, and it's not always the more the better.
Here's an artistic question from Bhavani Chandraksar. I would like to know about the interesting picture in your background. Why the white elephant in the star? Thank you. I will give priority to my sleep from now on.
This is a painting. It's
not the Republican Party, right?
God, no. This is a painting by my dearest friend Amriti, Julie Duffy, and she collected, she's an amazing painter, but she collected, this is from her trip to India, one of many, many trips to India, but all of this around here is trash that she collected in India, and then she made this painting, and it's just, I adore it. so I always feature it as something for people to look at while I'm talking.
Okay, here's another question from Peter O. I think we can get through all the questions. We just a couple more minutes. Sleep disturbances can be caused by the immune system, such as in those with cancer. By what mechanism is the immune system disturbing sleep in these cases? Do they know that? In what way it causes the problem?
So I don't know about the directionality that you're talking about, Peter. I do know that there is a directionality of sleep benefiting the immune system. There is research that show, I don't know if that's what you mean, that maybe fragmented sleep, poor sleep, this might be what you're talking about. So it's not that good sleep can deteriorate the immune system, but it's that poor sleep can deteriorate the immune system. So there's some amazing research where, here's just one of the wacky ways people have studied this. People are put into hotel rooms by themselves, and they're, some of them are kind of poorly sleeping and others are better sleeping, and then they're given rhinovirus spray in their nose. So they're given a virus, and then they're just watched. They're by themselves in these hotel rooms for like a week or so, and they look at the scientists then look at who becomes ill from the rhinovirus, and what you find is that the sleep prior to getting experimental rhinovirus predicted who got sick. The people who slept more poorly, who had decreased total sleep time in the week prior, were the ones who were more susceptible to the virus. You also find that there's a whole body of research that looks at how post-vaccination sleep can have an impact on whether the vaccination, how powerful the vaccination is in preventing disease. So there's definitely a relationship with, how good your sleep is and your immune system.
And so the immune system is affected by poor sleep and is aided by good sleep. Is there any time that the immune system attacks sleep? No. Does the immune system ever cause disturbances in the sleep itself? Is there any research like that?
That's a really interesting idea. I mean, it's probable that there is. I'm thinking about cancer actually, because there's a lot of research that shows that people with cancer do have poor sleep. And there's a lot of research that shows that chemotherapy really messes with people's circadian rhythms.
Right.
So you get, and that's why these light box therapy treatments after chemotherapy are super beneficial to improving sleep in people with that issue. But I can't think of exactly anything that's popping up in my head. There probably is something in my head, but I can't think of it right now.
All right, here's an interesting question from Diane B. Why isn't the protein trash that gets washed out by the glial cells, why does it not get washed out on the second night? How would the glial cells be able to distinguish between new trash proteins and old trash proteins, so the ones that were left over from the night before?
Yeah, it's probably not. It's not like a selective thing.
Right.
It's just an amount.
Just an amount.
It's sort of like the cumulative protein trash that you're talking about. I love that. That it's a cumulative effect. That there's only a certain amount that you can do. So if you don't kind of, if you get behind in your sleep, that you can get behind in your cleaning.
Yeah. So you should floss.
You need to floss. Yeah.
And here we'll finish with this one. From Diane B. also. How important is the timing of sleep? Does it need to be synced with daylight and nighttime for more restorative sleep? And you had some information in your book about people who worked at night, And
yeah. So there is no doubt that that working at night shift is not good for your health, right? That has been established. Are there people who are night owls who may actually have a shifted rhythm that are perfectly healthy? Yes, of course. So where the night owls come from, and is it a biological shift that really is, or do they have circadian differences in terms of biologically circadian differences? Is it a preference thing? This requires more research, and why this is there, we just don't know. I'm super interested in this topic, and you can see in the book I talk about it a lot.
Right.
I constantly am coming back to this idea of what is going on with these different phases, and what do we see in cultures that don't have exposure to electricity? Do they have different phases of sleep? And so there's a lot. I think that there's a lot of big questions that are completely unanswered. So it's a good question, and I don't think that we really know enough. But please, read the book and try to see what you think about some of these different studies, because I think that there's a nature nurture in there, right? And we don't know there's probably some nature in terms of that there are some biological differences why people stay up as long as they do. And that maybe those people really do have a whole system that's shifted, and they can get the same upstate, downstate benefits, without paying attention to the sun. Or that maybe it's reversed, or something that may be true. There's also research that shows that, when people have never been exposed to electrical light, you don't see any phase differences across people within that culture. So there's obviously a strong learned component to our night owl kind of behaviors. So, I think that we don't really understand enough about chronotypes, and I think that's a really interesting topic.
And if you're very interested, go to grad school, because a lot more research needs to be done. right?
Yes, science.
So thank you very much, Dr. Mednick, for sharing your research and what's going on with the latest in brain research in addition to sleep research. And anyone who wants to know more detail, especially the practical things, we didn't get to very many of them, but there's another dozens and dozens in her book. And so ends another event of the Commonwealth Club in its 120th year of enlightened discussion. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you very much, Dr. Mednick, for bringing
Thank you
your book
so
to us.
much for having me. It was a total delight. It was so much fun talking.
Thank you.